Before I introduce our main speaker for this evening, I would like to call to the microphone Father Melchizedek, who is representing our college dean this evening, to say a few words. Please make him feel welcome. Padre μου.
Μεταφέροντας τις ευχές του Σεβασμιωτάτου Αρχιεπισκόπου Αυστραλίας κυρίου Μακαρίου προς όλους εσάς για την ημέρα των Τριών Ιεραρχών και για τα έργα όπου ποιείται με το φως το αληθινό που φωτίζει όλο τον κόσμο, που έρχεται στον κόσμο. Και γι' αυτό και οι τρεις ιεράρχες, όπου εορτάζουμε σήμερα και εορτάζει η Εκκλησία μας, ονομάζονται φωστήρες. Και έτσι εύχομαι σε όλους μας, εκ μέρους του Σεβασμιωτάτου, να είμαστε φωτισμένοι και αγιασμένοι από το φως το αληθινό που είναι ο ίδιος ο Κύριος ημών Ιησούς Χριστός. Χρόνια πολλά σε όλους.
So I'll introduce tonight's speaker, and Dr. Peter Diamandis will then thank the speaker and thank you all for coming at the end of the evening. So, tonight's public lecture will be offered by Dr. Vassilis Adrahtas. He is well known to all of us, but just a few introductory notes about Vassili. He was born in Sydney, Australia, but at the age of 8 years old, his family moved back to Greece, where he grew up and did his secondary and first tertiary studies in Athens. He studied theology at the University of Athens, where he successfully graduated with a Bachelor of Theology and a Master's in the Studies of Religion. In 2005, he defended his doctoral dissertation, the first of other doctoral dissertations to come, so his first doctoral dissertation in the Sociology of Religion at Pandion University. Dr. Adrahtas returned back to Australia in 2001 in order to complete his second doctoral dissertation at the University of Sydney, as though one is not enough, in the area of Indigenous spirituality. And for a while, many of you may not know, but he taught here at St. Andrews before going back to Greece. Returning permanently to Australia in 2010, he has been involved in various initiatives with the Hellenic Open University and has taught modern and classical Greek for different educational programs. And the title of his presentation tonight is Hellenism Transformed, in the Light of Christ, the Three Hierarchs in World History Perspective. So, ladies and gentlemen, please make him feel welcome.
Please allow me to use a bit of Greek as a start. Πανωσιολογιότατε, σεβαστοί πατέρες, αγαπητοί αδελφοί, είναι καταρχάς μεγάλη συγκίνηση που βρίσκομαι απόψε εδώ και κάνω αυτή την ομιλία, γιατί η τελευταία φορά, Φίλιππε, που ήμουν εδώ ήταν πριν από 17 χρόνια. Πριν από 17 χρόνια μίλησα πάλι εδώ. Και το θυμάμαι πολύ καθαρά, γιατί ήταν Μάιος, γιατί η ομιλία ήταν για την πτώση της πόλης, ήταν Μάιος, του 2003. Πέρασαν 17 χρόνια. Η συγκίνηση είναι μεγάλη. Βέβαια, ο χρόνος περνάει διαφορετικά για τους ανθρώπους και διαφορετικά για το Θεό. Και υπό μία έννοια αισθάνομαι και λίγο περίεργα, διότι παραδόξως πώς μου φαίνεται σαν να ήταν χθες. Σαν να ήταν χθες. Τέλος πάντων, ταυτόχρονα όμως είναι πολύ μεγάλη χαρά. Πέρα από τη συγκίνηση υπάρχει πολύ μεγάλη χαρά, διότι πάλι όπως συζητάγαμε με τον Φίλιππο, είναι η πρώτη φορά που γίνεται ομιλία, πανηγυρικός όπως συνηθίζουμε να λέμε στα ελληνικά, για τους τρεις ιεράρχες. Δεν είχαμε ποτέ, και αυτό είναι άλλο παράδοξο, ποτέ ομιλία, πανηγυρικό λόγο για τους τρεις ιεράρχες. Πανωσιολογιότατε, θα ήθελα να μεταφέρετε εκ μέρους μου ένα πολύ μεγάλο θερμό ευχαριστώ στον Σεβασμιότατο για την ευλογία που μας έδωσε να κάνουμε σήμερα αυτήν την ομιλία. Θέλω να ευχαριστήσω τη Θεολογική Σχολή και βεβαίως την AHEA, the Australian Hellenic Educators Association, που συνδιοργανώνουν αυτό το απόψινό και μου δίνουν και εμένα τη δυνατότητα να πω 5 πράγματα. Και ελπίζω να μην σας απογοητεύσω. Λοιπόν, τώρα θα περάσουμε στα αγγλικά. My talk is going to be in English. Hellenism transformed in the light of Christ. The Three Hierarchs in World History Perspective. Introduction. On reflection, I would definitely say that the aim of this paper is too ambitious, and this for a number of reasons. Firstly, it aspires to discuss the figures known as the Three Hierarchs from a world history perspective. Secondly, it aspires to bring into this discussion the entire history of the transformation of Hellenism in its encounter with Christianity. Thirdly, it aspires to bring forth the profound theological dimension that the transformation of Hellenism has had within and throughout world history. And finally, it aspires to show how this theological dimension was paradigmatically fleshed out in the thought, work, and life of the Three Hierarchs. But, to put it in other words, all this is simply too much for a 45-minute talk. Nevertheless, I have always cherished the thought that it is the Three Hierarchs who have been simply too much for our history. Thus, if I fail to do justice to their contribution, which by the way is the most likely scenario, this will only be a further proof of the greatness that they stand for, both for the Church and world history. The Three Hierarchs. St. Basil the Great, St. Gregory the Theologian, and St. John Chrysostom, a thrice hypostatic image and likeness of the all-holy Trinity. For the consciousness of the Church, none of them is greater than the other. Each of them is absolutely unique in their ecclesial bearing, and most of all, each one of them has become inextricably united with the others in their historical realization of the kingdom of God. In the case of St. Basil and St. Gregory, according to the words of the latter, it seemed as if one soul inhabited 2 bodies, for they developed a lifelong and deep friendship. However, St. John was, in a sense, a stranger to them, a stranger in terms of geography and chronology, but not in terms of eternity, since within the eschatological realization of the kingdom of God, the 3 of them served the same purpose, namely, the transformation of Hellenism in the light of Christ for the sake of a new history, a history to be. And perhaps the most amazing thing is that this new history, still with us until this very day, took only 50 years to be created. From 357, when St. Basil returned full of energy and enthusiasm from Athens to his homeland in Cappadocia, to 407, when St. John died an exile, sick and suffering, at Comana of Pontus. The Three Hierarchs, although not of this world, remained steadfastly engaged in and with this world. They were part and parcel of their times and milieu, as well as the culture and education of late antiquity. They studied at the great pagan centers of learning in Athens, Alexandria, and Antioch. St. Basil and St. John were taught rhetoric by the master of the discipline in their day, namely the renowned pagan Libanius, and St. Gregory even taught for a couple of years at the reconstituted academy in Athens. Moreover, St. Basil inaugurated his Christian literary output with a work immersed in Hellenic wisdom entitled To the Youth, on how they might benefit from Hellenic literature. St. Gregory clashed head-on with the Emperor Julian, defending the right of the Christians to regard Hellenic letters as their own heritage and not only as a pagan one. And lastly, it is said that on his deathbed, Libanius confessed that due to the accomplishment of rhetoric he saw in St. John Chrysostom, the latter would have been his rightful successor. I could go on and on with similar examples, but one need only read through the works of these great fathers and teachers of the Church to witness the plethora and pervasiveness of the Hellenic world in their respective Christian worldviews. The celebration of the Feast of the Three Hierarchs. The Feast of the Three Hierarchs is mentioned for the first time in the second half of the 11th century, along with the name of Ioannis Mavropous, Metropolitan of Ephaita, who is said to have introduced the feast and to have composed the relevant liturgical canon. Both the name and the time, though, are indicative of what Paul Lemaire has dubbed First Byzantine Humanism, especially its late phase. According to legend, the people of Constantinople were divided into competing factions, each promulgating the superiority of one of the three hierarchs over against the others. But here a question arises naturally. How did this development come about socio-culturally? Why would someone get into the trouble of such religious discrimination in the first place? Given that the period in question was characterized by a renewed interest in Hellenic letters and/or wisdom, and given furthermore that the number of Christian alternatives to counterbalance this challenge were put forward, it is only reasonable to assume that the names of St. Basil, St. Gregory, and St. John were initially utilized in order to suggest the best possible example of a Christian who appreciated, appropriated, and at the same time neutralized Hellenism. Hence the rivalry. But then it must have been felt that the challenge posed by the early Byzantine secularists could be better dealt with by combining and not by dividing forces. If anything, this seems to be a very likely explanation of the emergence of the Feast of the Three Hierarchs. In any case, the liturgical celebration of the Feast of the Three Hierarchs was not intended as a socio-cultural celebration of paideia, learning and educational institutions, although indirectly it was bound to evoke such sensitivities. As already mentioned, initially the Three Hierarchs were an answer to the more or less secular Hellenic challenge, but very soon they became a token of what Byzantine Christianity stood for, namely the integration of Hellenism within Christian experience, a quality that was regarded as differentiating unmistakably the Christians of the East from those of the West. It is only very recently, and basically within the Greek-speaking world, that the celebration of the feast became explicitly related to the modern value of education, by serving a series of ideological agendas within the modern Greek state and all for the sake of Greek national ethnic identity. These are A, the synergy and co-responsibility of the state and the church with regards to education from the mid-19th century onwards. B, the ethics and aesthetics of the so-called Hellenic Christian civilization, Ελληνοχριστιανικός πολιτισμός, during the 1930-1960 period, and C, a moderate version of the values that make up Greco-Orthodoxy, Ελληνορθοδοξία, during the 1960-1990 period. To phrase it otherwise, the Feast of the Three Hierarchs, beyond, or perhaps better, thanks to a core meaning concerning the relationship between Hellenism and Christianity, has lent itself to a variety of interpretative perspectives. Consequently, the question we have to answer nowadays is the following: what exactly do the Three Hierarchs have to offer today? What do they represent for us in the 21st century? The transformation of Hellenism. According to the title of the present paper, the three hierarchs effected the transformation of Hellenism. The transformation of Hellenism in, through, and as history. However, in order to truly appreciate what this means, I have to elucidate the two key hermeneutic assumptions upon which my approach rests. The first is based on logic and is more or less philosophical in nature, while the second is based on faith and is purely theological. More specifically, these assumptions comprise the following two questions. What is Hellenism? And how should one conceptualize its transformation? These two issues are anything but self-evident or indisputable. In particular, at the time of the three hierarchs, the term Hellenism was used along with other cognate terms such as Hellenes and the Hellenic, to Hellenikon. Hellenism could denote a number of things. The everyday or learned use of Greek by native speakers of other languages, linguistic and or literary Hellenism, a way of life made up of certain customs and values, cultural Hellenism, a way of thinking, conceptual Hellenism, and also a set of religious traditions, hierophanic Hellenism. For the purposes of this talk, although the aforementioned meanings have been taken into consideration, Hellenism is primarily and basically used in the heightened anthropological sense of being. And this is no other than the sublime yet tragic pursuit of true knowledge, episteme. To put it otherwise, Hellenism is the differentiated realization of what throughout space and time has been invariably identified and recognized as a distinctively Hellenic ideal: to contemplate and imitate nature, physis. Furthermore, throughout this paper, whenever I mention the transformation of Hellenism, I do not just have in mind some generic concept of change, alteration, or transmutation. What I predominantly have in mind is the notion of transfiguration in the heightened theological sense. In other words, my approach is informed by the gospel narratives of the transfiguration of Jesus. In his act of transfiguration, our Lord Jesus Christ changed without changing. He became other by remaining the same. And in an instant, he realized his eternal being. Simply put, the transfigured Jesus is the eschatological Jesus, what Jesus was, is, and will always be about. And this experienced in an incomprehensible and therefore revelatory manner. Thus, when we experience the transfiguration of Jesus, we experience the equivalence between his being and his becoming, the concurrence of his eternity and his history, the identification of the Son of God and the Son of Man. This is the light of Christ that we have received and continue to receive time and again. With regards to Hellenism, all this means that for the Christian experience of the light of Christ, and for that matter, within this experience, a particular human life order, namely the Hellenic, became what it was always supposed to be. In the countenance of the transfigured Son of Man, the faithful have come to witness the countenance of the Hellenic life order within the kingdom of God. In God the Logos, it has been given to us to see the Logos of the Hellenic being finally realized. The Hellenic as an eternal category of Christian existence, as Father George Florovsky would have said. A paradox that needs to be resolved. In light of the working definition of Hellenism just presented, it is quite clear that in the case of the relationship between Hellenism and Christianity, world history was faced with a tension, to say the least. If the contemplation and imitation of nature, and for that matter, of the divine as nature, pertain to the Hellenic as a tangible spatio-temporal phenomenon, and if both of them are achieved or frustratingly missed in the process of pursuing rationally justified knowledge, one does not need to struggle much in order to prove that Christianity does not fit this picture. The ideal of the sage and the ideal of the saint simply mean that Hellenism is one thing and Christianity is quite another. Contemplation, theoria, and imitation, mimesis, if they were to be regarded as guiding ideas for the self-determination of of Christianity, something that eventually did happen, pertain to the divine as other to nature. Conversely, as already noted, the plethora and pervasiveness of Hellenism are so conspicuous in the oeuvre of the three hierarchs that one seems to be tempted to speak in their case about a Hellenic flesh animated by the Christian spirit. In modern Greek-speaking Orthodox theology, the most pronounced version of this understanding has been the theoretical construction of Hellenic Christianity, Ελληνοχριστιανισμός, by such prominent academic theologians as Dimitrios Balanos, Panagiotis Bratsiotis, and Panagiotis Trembellas. However, Elder Epiphanios Theodoropoulos of blessed memory published a seminal and rigorous criticism against the whole idea of Hellenic Christianity as being selective, oversimplistic, and by extension misleading. And to my understanding, his reading remains decisive and conclusive. Both the esteemed academic theologians and Elder Epiphanios are correct, but for different reasons and on different levels. One cannot deny, in agreement with the advocates of Hellenic Christianity, that the three hierarchs were involved in Hellenism in ways that betray that after them the latter would never be the same again. That they changed the course of the historical development of Hellenism by immersing themselves in it and remaining within it. But equally so, in agreement with Elder Epiphanios, one cannot deny that somehow this in was at the same time an out, and that paradoxically the with was nonetheless a without. How else can one make sense of confessions like the following by St. Basil? I had wasted much time on follies and spent nearly all my youth in vain labors and devotion to the teachings of a wisdom that God had made foolish. Suddenly I awoke as out of a deep sleep. I beheld the wonderful light of the gospel truth, and I recognized the nothingness of the wisdom of the princes of this world that has come to naught. I shed a flood of tears over my wretched life. A new way to look at an old problem. The dialectics between Hellenism and Christianity found in the three hierarchs require a firm analytical framework in order to be accounted for and justified. Accordingly, I propose two conceptual triptychs and one set of methodological distinctions. Firstly, when one studies the engagement of the three hierarchs and more generally the engagement of the church fathers with Hellenism, the first thing they should have in mind is that Hellenism involves A. Hellenoidea, Ελληνοίδια. That is, the very phenomenon that makes Hellenism distinctive. B. Hellenotopia, Ελληνοτοπία. that is, the spatio-temporal continuum that became the living space of the Hellenes. And C, Hellenotropia, Hellenotropia, that is, the differentiated, comprehensive, and genuine set of modes through which the Hellenic is realized in space and time. Regarding these realities, categories, it could be said that while experiencing the disintegration of Hellenotopia, the three hierarchs were open and eclectic as to Hellenotropia, but very, very critical of Hellenoidea. In other words, although they could easily use this or that tropos of the Hellenic, literary genre, philosophical schools, artistic traditions, ethical conventions, religious elements, you name it, they were particularly wary about the eidos of the Hellenic. For they clearly understood that as far as the distinctiveness, irreducibility, and novelty of Christianity was concerned, this eidos was the crux of the whole matter. But what exactly is Hellenoidea? What exactly is the phenomenon that makes Hellenism distinctive in its own right by means of contemplating and imitating nature through the pursuit of rationally justified knowledge? Here is where my second conceptual triptych comes in. Although Hellenotopia became a reality through a trajectory in time that united and homogenized a variety of localities in the Mediterranean and the Near East over 4,000 years, and despite the fact that Hellenotropia has always been a differentiated set of social cultural resources, Hellenism has always been seen as a distinct entity. Regardless of the ever-changing continuum within which it was manifested, or the diverse legacy it gave rise to, the integrity, oneness, and identity of the Hellenic were always taken for granted. However, this unity in diversity complex that is evident in the case of the Hellenic, or better, in the case of Hellenoidea, took basically three forms, which I would like to categorize as follows. Cataphatic Hellenism, καταφατικός Ελληνισμός, apophatic Hellenism, αποφατικός Ελληνισμός, and preeminent Hellenism, υπεροχικός Ελληνισμός. Cataphatic Hellenism, or what in more modern terms we would call positivist Hellenism, θετικιστικός Ελληνισμός, was the type of Hellenism that reduced Hellenoidea to one or more modes of Hellenotropia. More specifically, due to the powerful challenge of the other, and in particular Christianity, certain Hellenic circles opted for a definitive and fixed identity, mainly on the basis of religion and or philosophy. For example, the Neoplatonic schools, or the alleged restoration of the Hellenic religion under Emperor Julian. In turn, apophatic Hellenism, or again in more modern terms, what we would call indeterminate Hellenism, ακαθόριστος Ελληνισμός, was a type of Hellenism that refrained from identifying Hellenoidea with any of the modes of Hellenotropia. To be sure, this remained by far the most prevalent attitude of the Hellenes towards their own identity, allowing the latter to be elusive and fluid and by extension adaptable. Lastly, preeminent Hellenism or transcendental Hellenism, υπερβασιακός Ελληνισμός, is the type of Hellenism that did not just refrain from identifying Hellenoidea with any of the modes of Hellenotropia, but took the former as transcending, enriching, and reconstituting again and again and again the latter. This was the type of Hellenism that the Hellenes who converted to Christianity experienced and identified with, since it brought forward Hellenoidea as a kind of intentionality in time that yearned for its future fulfillment. In light of the above, one can start appreciating what actually happened in the case of St. Basil's, St. Gregory's, and St. John's engagement with Hellenism. Their primary concern was not to find similar or compatible elements between Christianity and Hellenism, but to keep their faith intact over against the Hellenic, and at the same time claim the latter for the kingdom of God. For this reason, they did not trouble themselves so much about this or that tropos of the Hellenic, but instead focused on how they could accommodate the eidos of the Hellenic without confusing it with the experience of divine revelation. The remarkable thing with the three hierarchs is that they did not seek an easy or superficial solution to this problem, but on the contrary, confronted it head on. They discerned the core of the problem. They pointed out the actual weakness of Hellenism as its potential strength. And they embodied the transformation required within their very thought, work, and life. The transformation of Hellenism, effected by the three hierarchs, was something qualitatively different to what had already been happening since the first century in Christian theological circles. That was a preparation and a kind of sorting out of things. This was a realization and a reconstitution, a new heaven and a new earth, a new history. To be honest, nothing more and nothing better could be done with the dissection, so to speak, of Hellenism that had already been achieved by Origen in Alexandria by the middle of the 3rd century. He had studied superbly and experimented widely with the causality involved in the eidos of Hellenism. Efficient, material, formal, and final causality, according to Aristotle's famous division. But apparently, it had not been given to him to conceive and realize their unity with the eidos of Christianity. And for that matter, unconfusedly, unchangeably, indivisibly, inseparably. But God works in history, and divine revelation is inextricably related to historicity, which means that the time, the fullness of time, was yet to come. And it did come with the advent of the 4th century, when all objective conditions changed drastically in favor of a new history taking over an old life world. At last, it was time to move from the mere adoption, adaptation, combination, or even appropriation of materials and forms from the Hellenic cultural, conceptual, and religious capital to the integral communication between the quintessence of the Hellenic, namely the yearning to overcome the innate limitations of self-consciousness, on the one hand, and the uniqueness of Christianity, namely the revelation of life in God, the abundance of life in the person and ministry of Jesus Christ, on the other. This was programmatically the conscious objective of the three hierarchs, regardless of whether or to what extent they had envisaged the implications of their engagement with Hellenism at the level of world history. Besides, to put it as simply as possible, when God calls one to follow his divine will, to do his work, he's not required to disclose his broader plan in advance. It is only in retrospect that we come to realize his comprehensive purposes. And this is exactly what happened in the case of the three hierarchs. What did the three hierarchs offer Hellenism? The three hierarchs offered Hellenism what it lacked, what it needed, what it desperately was longing for. Living within the gradual collapse of Hellenotopia, a collapse they experienced as the immediate condition that gave rise to the cry for salvation on the part of the contemporaries, the three hierarchs responded by reaching out to those who were caught in the middle of it all, by stretching out their hand in order to take the hand of Hellenism. A hand that had been waiting patiently and wide open for centuries, most likely since the time of Plato. The two hands met and grabbed one another and have remained thus ever after. Why? Because Hellenism had an overwhelming being, in, but no real beings, οντότητες. It had an amazing rationality, logos, but no personality, προσωπικότητα. It had order, law, and justice, but no philanthropy, freedom, and love. It knew of tragic greatness, but it could learn a lot from sublime humility. This is what the three hierarchs offered Hellenism. In effect, they turned Hellenism into something greater than itself by allowing it to establish a unity with its other in antiquity, namely Judaism. In particular, according to the great father and teacher of the church, St. John Damascene, the differentia specifica of Christianity, it is the doctrine of the all-holy Trinity, the doctrine that the three hierarchs articulated in the best possible way, is neither Hellenic nor Jewish, but both of them at once. It is this synthesis that paved the way for something entirely new in the history of mankind. In itself, not part of a synthesis, but the intentionality of a synthesis, an intentionality that was manifested once and for all in Jesus Christ. But we should turn to the words of the three hierarchs themselves and see the transformation of Hellenism in the idiom characteristic of each one of them. St. Basil the Great on ontology. In his exegetical homiletic work on the 6 days of creation, namely the Exaímeron, St. Basil the Great articulates a number of themes that will become typical of Christian ontology. The dialectics between the uncreated and the created, humanity's image and likeness in its capacity as contemplator mundi, the eschatological fulfillment of all creation in the glorified human nature of God the Logos, and humanity's proper responsibility to know the created order and foster the course of creation towards perfection. His philosophical background, so to speak, in this regard is basically Stoic. But what he manages, as the following passage makes quite clear, is to work through the discrepancies, contradictions, and tensions inherent within Stoicism by using the latter's own theoretical terms, means, in order to show a certain insufficiency of the Hellenic worldview, an insufficiency that requires an entirely new conceptualization of both the divine and nature. St. Basil. The counterfeiters of truth, those who do not teach the mind to follow the Holy Scripture, but distort the meaning of the Holy Scriptures according to their own will, claim that it is matter that is indicated through these words. For matter, they say, is by nature without form and invisible. Aόρατος, ακατασκεύαστος. Being according to its very logos without quality and foreign to all forms and figures. And this is what the artificer received and formed in his wisdom, and led it to be orderly, and thus brought visible things into being. However, if matter is uncreated, firstly, it must be equal to God. demanding the same honor. Could there be anything more impious than this? Namely, to have something without quality, without form, an extreme deformity, ugliness beyond configuration, I'm using their own expression, enjoying the same prerogatives as the wise and powerful and all beautiful creator and maker of everything? Secondly, if matter is so great as to receive the whole episteme of God, in this way they would somehow be comparing its existence with the impenetrable power of God, since it would be able to measure by itself all the intelligence of God. On the other hand, if matter does not match the energy of God, then their argument would turn into a more absurd blasphemy. For due to the lack of matter, they would be keeping God idle and inactive as to his own works. But the poverty of human nature has deceived them. This is the opinion they have about divine creation. On the one hand, the form of the world was added by the wisdom of the maker of everything, while on the other, matter was given to the creator from without. And so the world came to be composite, having acquired its substratum and essence from outside, but shape and form from God. Thus they come to deny that mighty God was in control of the constitution of all beings, as if he just took part in some kind of collection and that only a small portion was contributed by him to the genesis of beings. They haven't been able to look upon the truth because of the debasement of their reasoning. But God, before anything of what is now visible existed, having put in his mind and having dashed to bring non-beings into being, envisaged at once what kind of world the world should be, and along with that gave rise to the matter that matched its form. And he welded the entire world, which came to be diverse, in a state of fellowship and harmony by establishing some kind of indissoluble attachment, so that even those parts most distant from one another in terms of position would appear united through sympathy. Let them then cease their myth-like fictions. I mean, those who pretend to measure through the weakness of their own reasoning the power that is incomprehensible and totally ineffable to human voice. God created the heavens and the earth. Not just half of them, but the entire heaven and the entire earth, conceiving of their very essence along with their form. He is not an inventor of shapes, but the creator of the very essence of beings. Furthermore, let them tell us, how did the efficient power of God and the passive nature of matter concur, the latter offering the substratum without form, while the form possessing the epistemial forms without matter, so that each of them could receive from the other what they were in need of. St. Gregory's reflection on political theology. Perhaps the most important theological works of the theologian par excellence, it is St. Gregory Nazianzen, are his theological orations. In just 5 homilies, it was given to him to articulate the doctrine of the All Holy Trinity in an unprecedented and unsurpassable way. Coming as he were from a more or less Platonic background, he was well aware of the limitations and challenges of language, as well as the need to stretch the latter in order to turn ontology into aesthetics. St. Gregory takes all this to a totally new level, faced as he is with the mystery of God. At the same time, the aesthetics of his theology are turned into a fascinating insight into the anthropological demand for unity and freedom, a demand that surprisingly has awakened the interest of some of the most prominent figures in modern political theory: Schmidt, Erickson, Gaben, Gurgunis, and others. From the relevant passage that follows, one can appreciate both his transformative intervention with regards to the Platonic perspective and his everlasting appeal to the world history of ideas. St. Gregory. Concerning God, three are the viewpoints of old: the non-principle, anarchia; the multi-principle, polyarchia; and the mono-principle, monarchia. The two, of course, have been played as a game by those who are like children amongst the Hellenes. And let them be played. For what has no principle is orderless. And what has multiple principles is factious, and so of no principle, and thus orderless. And both of them lead to the same, i.e., disorder, and the latter to dissolution. For disorder works out dissolution. What is honored by us, though, is the mono-principle. Not the mono-principle that one person encompasses, because it is possible for the one, when it's factious to itself, to become many, but which parity of nature constitutes, as well as concord of will and identity of movement and convergence towards the one on the part of those that originate from it. And this is unfeasible as far as created nature is concerned. So that even if it is the mono-principle, is differentiated in number, it is not severed with regards to essence. For this reason, the monad, having moved from the beginning towards the dyad, stopped at the triad. And this is for us the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. The first is begetter and emitter. I say this without having in mind passion and time and body. And of the remainder, one is begotten and the other emitted. Or I do not know how one should call them after having detracted them totally from things visible. And of course we shall not take the liberty to speak of an overflowing of goodness, which is what one of those who philosophized amongst the Hellenes dared say, in the manner that a crater would overflow, as he explicitly states in such words, by which he philosophizes about the first and the second cause, so that we may not risk introducing the begetting as involuntary and as if it were like a natural and hard to repress excretion, something hardly appropriate to the notions pertaining to divinity. For this reason, standing within our limitations, we introduce the unbegotten and the begotten and the one emitted from the Father, as in a passage the God and Logos says himself. This is how we respond to those who try to puzzle us. Not willingly, of course, for to chatter idly and argue are disagreeable to the faithful. And besides, one adversary is enough. But out of necessity, due to our assailants. Medicines, after all, exist because of diseases, so that they may realize that they are not all wise or invincible in what makes the gospel null and void. For when we put forward the power of argumentation, setting aside faith, and we abolish the faithfulness of the Spirit, and subsequently our argumentation cannot match the importance of the subject, and by necessity it will not match it, coming as it is from such weak an organ as our intellect, what shall happen? The weakness of argumentation looks as if it is the weakness of the mystery, and thus eloquence empties the cross of its power. But the fulfillment of our reasoning is faith. John Chrysostom on the incomprehensibility of the divine. The Hellenic experience of the divine did not really cherish the idea of incomprehensibility. For the Hellenes, the noetic dimension of humanity was so much and so closely related to the divine as nature that they simply could not ascribe to any absolute understanding of incomprehensibility. Christianity came along with a radically different approach that was bound to create a new type of homo religiosus, a personality, a praxis, and an ethos based on the foundational significance of humility. Amongst the great fathers and teachers of the Church during the 4th and 5th centuries, those who wrote abundantly about divine incomprehensibility, amongst those, namely St. Gregory of Nyssa, St. John Chrysostom, and St. Cyril of Alexandria, St. John was undoubtedly the one that more than anyone else made the idea part and parcel of the popular imaginary, by casting it in the most pronounced terms of Christian ethics. If anything, the following excerpts from his orations against the Anomians show that even the Antiochian school of theology, so much at home with Aristotelian rationalism, could and did go beyond the limits of reason by acknowledging them. St. John. It is a sign of utmost madness to quarrel about knowing what God is in his essence. That there is a God, he, that's the prophet, knows. But he ignores what he is in his essence. That God is wise, he does know. But he ignores how much wise he is. He does not ignore that God is great. But how much great he is, or what kind is his greatness, this he does not know. That he is present everywhere, he knows, but he does not know how. That he provides for and holds and keeps everything together meticulously, this he does not ignore, but he does ignore the manner according to which he achieves this. Humans have had the audacity to say that they know God in the way that God knows himself. Does this require criticism? Does this need to be proved? Is not just the utterance of these very words enough to show their absolute impiety? Furthermore, we do not know divine incomprehensibility in the same way that those angelic powers know it, given the degree in which they are purer and wiser and more perceptive than human nature. For just like a person who is blind does not know the inaccessible nature of the sun's rays in the way that a person who is capable of seeing knows it, by the same token, we do not know God's incomprehensibility in the manner that they, the angels, do. God is not just incomprehensible to the cherubims or the seraphims, but also to the principalities and the powers and all created other entities. And the wiser they are, or the closer they are to that ineffable and blessed essence, the more they know divine incomprehensibility than we do. For an increase in wisdom causes an increase in reverence. But why am I talking about angels? When we do not know well enough, or to put it better, we do not know at all even the essence of our very soul. If they, the heretics, quarrel about knowing, ask them what the soul might be in terms of essence. Is it air, wind, or fire? But they will say that it's none of these, since all these are material bodies, but the soul is immaterial. Again, they do not know what angels are in all their own souls, and yet they quarrel about knowing in detail the Lord and Creator of everything. But what could be worse than this insanity? But why am I saying what the soul is in terms of essence, when we cannot even say in what way it is in the body? What could you possibly say regarding this? Perhaps that it's all over the body. But this is absurd, for such a thing happens only with material bodies. And that this is not valid in the case of the soul is evident from the following. Although many a time the hands and feet of people are cut off, the soul remains intact, not mutilated at all, due to the maiming of the body. But then we should say that it is not in the entire body, but confined in some part. In that case, the other parts would by necessity be dead. For what is soulless must be dead. But it is not possible to say this either, only that we know it is in our body, but we do not know how. And why am I referring to the Holy Scriptures? When the manifestation of unreasonableness is such, as well as the exaggeration of unlawfulness, that not even the Hellenes who erred as to the truth have ever attempted to say something like this. For none, not even amongst them, dared present a definition regarding divine essence or capture it in one word. But why am I mentioning divine essence when in their philosophizing, not even with regards to the nature of immaterial things, did they present a comprehensive definition, but only some kind of vague example and description? Conclusions. The three hierarchs have earned their place both in the consciousness of the Church and the firmament of ideas in world history. What I have attempted to show is that within the light of Christ, radiating from within their spiritual experience and existential struggle, they transformed Hellenism once and for all. After them, people have simply not seen again Hellenism through the same eyes. At the same time, they contributed immensely to the creation of the parameters that were to set the stage for a new history for humankind, namely the eschatological realization of the kingdom of God in time and space, as the Church. Notwithstanding, the three hierarchs are not just an issue of the past or the present. They are basically and primarily an issue of the future. If within the Church, the life of the Church, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever, this means that the ways of theology remain what they have always been. That is, the ways of the fathers. In this sense, there is no neo-patristic or even meta-patristic dilemmas for the faithful. Only a patristic witnessing. The three hierarchs are the most potent example of this patristic witnessing, especially for the youth. And what they demand from us today and tomorrow, what they demand from all of us, is to get out there and transform the whole world with all its cultures, with all its customs, with all its concepts, just like they did with Hellenism in their own times. Amen.
Stay there. I'll leave it to, as I said, Dr. Vassilis to thank. But before Vassilis come up, we'll open it up for questions. So we have some time for questions. Please put up your hand, say your name, and then ask your question loudly. Michael, do we have a microphone? And just wait for the microphone to come around.
I hope I have given food for thought, and questioning.
Definitely have. The first question is always the most difficult, but once we get started, then even if not questions, comments as well.
That's not a comment, that's a compliment. I don't want compliments. Yeah. By the way, Vicky's a specialist on St. Gregory Nazianzen, so perhaps she has a question.
Just something that I remember him writing.
Vicky,
Just wait, Vicky, for the microphone. It's going to be better that way.
The only comment I have about St. Gregory is something that comes to mind when he says, apax men o logos ipesti. And that fits so beautifully in with the Hellenism that you described, where the logos was so dominant in Platonic. It's
very interesting because in one phrase, you know, you have the transformation of Hellenism. You have ipesti, you know, which is all about, you know, being, which is so Hellenic. And apax, you know, which is so Christian. You know, Hellenes were not interested in the apax. They were interested in the eternal, the recurring. So apax ipesti. 2 words, and you have the whole, you know, transformed Hellenism. Thank you for reminding that. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk. My name is Graham. I have a sort of a question which is maybe Christology based, in that, can you make some comments on what these patristic fathers had to say about the divinity and humanity of Christ? It's a very broad question, but do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a huge, you know, issue, but I will try to say something very concisely and related to the topic, the transformation of Hellenism. Okay. So, in a section of my talk, I referred to the so-called definition of Chalcedon. You know, I quoted it. And for what reason? Because I wanted to show that Hellenism became part of Christianity, you know, asυγχύτως, ατρέπτος, αδιαιρέτος, αχωρίστος, which is the definition of Chalcedon, which, you know, is basically the quintessence of what you're asking. The God and the human in the person of Christ. Now, do we have this in Hellenism? Do we have this in Hellenism? Could we have this in Hellenism? Can the divine, you know, be united, you know, inseparably, without division, you know, with the human? We have gods that look human. We have humans that look divine. But we do not have, you know, a human who is God. Why is this impossible for Hellenism? It's impossible because to be someone is to be something very, 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 very particular, unique. So you have Jesus Christ, you have a unique person, unique. And this person, this unique person, is human and divine. Human he could be, no problem for a Hellene. So what? But divine, the divine is not unique, particular. The divine is universal, generic, καθόλου, as they would say. It looks, you know, manifested here and there, you know, through a form. But in its essence, it's generic. It can never be, you know, identified with a unique, particular person. So, what I'm saying is that the doctrine of the unity of divine and human nature in the person of Christ is basically an answer to the, let's say, hint, the insight that the Hellenes really had. Okay, they had a god called Dionysus, who was just as close as they could think, imagine, Jesus. But that's their limitation. Up to that point. So it's Jesus comes, and answers, fulfills, transcends, transforms that limitation. They have an insight, but they don't know what to do with it. And they have to wait. And they wait some 3-4 centuries. After Plato, they had to wait 3-4 centuries. But eventually, and don't forget what we said before, time in the eyes of God has a different pace. So 3-4 centuries is nothing. So they had to wait a bit in order to get the answer. I hope that's a concise answer. Yeah. Vicky.
I'm going to ask you, do you see Greek philosophy on being progressing in a historical way from Plato, Aristotle, the atomists, all the way down to the Stoics? Do you see that as a progression culminating in the birth of the Incarnation, the birth of Christ?
No, I don't.
Okay.
No. I know this is a schema that is, to be found in Christian literature, but I don't. I think that ancient Greek philosophy, like many other facets of Hellenism, were developing according to their own, logos. They were multiplying, they were growing, and they reached a point where, they just couldn't go further. And they required something other in order to, be released from their tensions. Mm-hmm. And that's what Christianity brings in. It's not, a sort of natural progression and we get there, where? Because that, personally, I believe, limits and misunderstands the nature of divine revelation and the initiative of God. St. Paul is very, very, clear on this, that I know as I have been known. I have been known. That's why I know. It's not that I grew in knowledge and at a certain point, I was ready for something. Yeah, that's my answer.
But what what I meant to say, I guess, is that all the debates, there were different philosophical debates going on. Like, for example, Parmenides, who comes out of the blue and says what he says. Even though there were different schools with different philosophical ideas, basically what they were trying with being and trying to understand this concept of being, do you see that evolving in Greek philosophy?
I see that as a theologian only within the plan of God. That I do see. What was happening with the Hellenes and what has been happening with lots of other peoples and lots of other cultures, what has been happening, in indigenous Australia, has not been happening, just like that. God not knowing what's going on or being, away from it. Okay, he has had a purpose for Hellenism. But he has had a purpose. That was not inherent, intrinsic within Hellenism. It's like you do something, for instance, which might be, the wrong thing even. And I turn it into something good.
How would they understand what they were trying to say? I had trouble understanding you today, and being a teacher, I had trouble understanding what your concept was. I'm just trying to put two things together and think it would be impossible for those people at that time really to understand their message.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Yeah, that's an interesting question. And it relates basically to, what happens, or what's the use of our theology when, people don't get it? Is it of any use? How many could understand, in their own times, Basil, Gregory, and St. John Chrysostom? How many? I suppose none, and everyone. What do I mean? At the, let's say, technical, theoretical level, perhaps those who understood them were themselves. They were talking amongst themselves. Yeah. I mean, when St. Basil writes a letter, and you have there, formulations regarding the Trinity, the letter is addressed to another bishop. It's not addressed to a congregation. What do they know? I don't know anything. But there are levels of understanding. The theoretical level of understanding is only one level. For instance, in the church, the life of the church, we don't understand only by words. Being part of a family means understanding lots of things. I can understand my mother better when she doesn't speak than when she speaks. Because I understand, how she looks, stares at me. The body language, I don't need, my mother. By the way, I have talked with my father 50 years, uttering, I suppose, 50 sentences. I have hardly talked with my father. Why? Because he didn't talk to anyone. But we could be in a room and we could, understand one another perfectly. I knew what he wanted, how he felt. There's lots of levels of understanding. Theologians, create an environment, a historicity, create, a sort of matrix within which, the faithful live. And living within that matrix, that environment we call church, they understand in the ways that the environment allows them to understand. And words, theoretical terms, are only for some, not for all. But they are very, very important for changing, history. They are not important for living our lives right now. They are important for the, in the long term. To put it, a bit, let's say, in a raw way, Why would God, make someone into a theologian? Why is God so interested in making theologians? Great fathers, universal teachers of the church, like, these three hierarchs. Why? For the long run. for the centuries, not for the here and now. The here and now is for other people, gifted people. You know, for a spiritual father, for instance. But not for a father and teacher of the church. A father and teacher of the church is for the long run. We shouldn't, miss sight, and the importance of the long run, the centuries, because we are interested, in the moment, in the here and now. Both are important. But in the church, we have different people with different gifts that do different things. A spiritual father deals with the here and now. A theologian deals with history. And both are required. Otherwise, the church is like a cripple. One leg or one hand. So, I suppose the Three Hierarchs, you know how, I'm going to dare this, I suppose St. Gregory will forgive me. You know how lousy was St. Gregory, in his interaction with people? He was so lousy. Leave me, guys, leave me. I don't want to be a bishop. I don't want to be an archbishop. I don't want your politics. I want to go, in the desert, there with the flowers and the birds, and, the flowing, waters, and meditate, with my Lord. Leave me. He was lousy. He couldn't, stand people. He was so shy. And this person, I would dare say this, in modern terms, this incompetent person, who would, if you had a business, would you, employ St. Gregory the Theologian? No way. He would see people and he would go away. Go away. Oh, God takes that person, that incompetent person, and he makes him the greatest theologian of all times. He takes Moses, who cannot speak. Moses couldn't speak properly. And he makes him the biggest prophet of all times. God chooses, the one we least expect. Least. And St. Gregory the Theologian was such a last choice.
Για να καταλάβω καλύτερα, όλα αυτά έγιναν 300 χρόνια μετά τη γέννηση του Χριστού και οι τρεις ιεράρχες ήσαν τον ίδιο καιρό.
Από το 357 που ο Βασίλειος φεύγει από την Αθήνα και γυρίζει στην Καπαδοκία μέχρι το 407, 50 χρόνια που πεθαίνει ο Ιωάννης ο Χρυσόστομος. Αυτά τα 50 χρόνια είναι τα χρυσά χρόνια της Εκκλησίας.
Ο ένας συνεχίζει μετά τον άλλον.
Οι δύο είναι φίλοι, συνομήλικοι. Ο Ιωάννης ο Χρυσόστομος είναι 20 χρόνια νεότερος. Περίπου 20 χρόνια νεότερος. Και οι δύο είναι φίλοι, συμμαθητές με τον Ιουλιανό, τον Αυτοκράτορα. Γι' αυτό και ο Γρηγόριος μιλάει στον Ιουλιανό σαν να είναι... Δηλαδή, τι Αυτοκράτορας, τι Αυτοκράτορας, ρε. Μαζί μας στην Αθήνα. Έτσι, Καντιλανάφτης ήσουνα. Yeah. You know what's Καντιλανάφτης? Καντιλανάφτης, the one that... Yeah. You were αναγνώστης, Καντιλανάφτης στην εκκλησία ήσουνα. Σε ξέραμε, δικό μας παιδί ήσουνα. Και τώρα μας το παίζεις ότι θα κάνεις restore the ancient Greek religion. Come on. Και that we don't have the right, we don't have the right to read the Greek, literature. Come on. Because you're only Greek if you believe in the Greek gods. Come on. If that was the definition of being Greek, θετικιστικός ελληνισμός, καταφατικός ελληνισμός, then Xenophanes, ο Xenophanes, the great Greek philosopher, wouldn't be a Greek. Because he was telling his contemporaries, 6th century before Christ, he was saying to his contemporaries, the gods you believe in, are just a fiction of your minds. Then he wouldn't be a Greek. Parmenides wouldn't be a Greek. All the luminaries of the Greeks wouldn't be Greeks. Because none of them really believed in the gods. They believed in the nature qua divine. And that's what the three hierarchs saw, really discerned. This is not our faith. This is where you're wrong. Not the many gods you have. That's superfluous, that's not superficial. That's not the real problem. The real problem is, if nature is God or no. Sorry. I'm just carried away.
I know we're honoring the three hierarchs, but can we include other hierarchs for the Hellenic transformation? Which would you say?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, who would be the others who transform things? Yeah, names come, in a way automatically. Saint Gregory of Nyssa. The other Cappadocian, the brother of Saint Basil. Saint Cyril of Alexandria. Saint Maximus, the confessor. Saint John Damascene. Saint Photius, the great one. And then, basically, mission accomplished by the 9th century. Mission accomplished. The other fathers don't really mess with that. It's already done. Perhaps Photius is the last one who deals with the last, challenges of this transformation.
Can you tell us a bit about him? Just a few sentences.
We have a person here who has written a doctorate on Saint Photius, Dimitri. So I don't want to, go into his field, but to give you just an idea, if we know nowadays that the 50 books, it's a fiction number, okay, the 50 books of Hellenism that we have, and we know this is Hellenism, these 50 books. If we know today that these 50 books were not 50, but they were 75, to whom do we owe this secret knowledge? We owe it to Photius. Because he had them in his library, his personal library. He was reading them, he was putting them down, comments, he was, really talking with those books, those manuscripts, those works, and we know that they existed. Thanks to this Christian, we know we have a better understanding of what Hellenism looked like. That's why he's beloved, he's cherished, by all philologists and, experts in modern Greek and ancient Greek letters. Because he gives us this insight into this, unknown Hellenism, which we have lost. I think, if I may just wrap this up, I think this topic, the Three Hierarchs topic, is a very important one, especially for Christians who are at the same time Greeks, because it's always a reminder of the tension of the relationship between those two phenomena, but not just the tension, but also the resolution that took place. It's not, I think personally, as a Greek and as a Christian, it's not bad to be faced with the tensions. If, of course, you know that there has been a resolution, there has been a surpassing. On the contrary, the more you ponder, over these tensions, the more you appreciate both of them. And something I would like to, close with this, because it's a huge misunderstanding. We talk about, in Greek, ελληνοχριστιανική σύνθεση, λέμε. Σύνθεση. Πατήρ Επιφάνιος, δεν ξέρω αν ξέρετε τον πατέρα Επιφάνιο Θεοδωρόπουλο, Το κονιορτοποίησε, δηλαδή το έκανε σκόνη αυτό. Ότι αυτό είναι βλακίες, τι είναι αυτά που λέτε. Δεν υπάρχει το πράγμα. Ελληνοχριστιανική σύνθεση. What's really going on? There is a synthesis. Υπάρχει όντως σύνθεση. But it's not between Christianity and Hellenism. That's what is wrong. The synthesis is between Judaism and Hellenism. The two elements that are combined are Judaism and Hellenism. And who combines them? And who makes something new out of them? Christianity. Christianity is not a particular element of a synthesis. Christianity is the guiding force, the guiding principle of the synthesis. So yes, there is a synthesis involved, but it's not of Christianity with something else. It's by Christianity of two other elements.